we've worked on, got it. We've worked on many different lakes, and I think that's part of the reason we're speaking with you tonight is over the years, we've had a chance to work on, all these different watersheds that you can see in green on the map on the left of your screen. And it really gives us a chance to make comparisons. And the 9 plans you see on your screen on the right, those are all watershed management plans, like the ones, the 2 that we've done for the Ossipee Lake region, Danforth Pond region. And in this situation, each of these water bodies and watersheds is very unique. And so that's, some of the things that we'll share with you tonight are some stories on some of these other lakes, not just the local area. Oh, I don't know why it's being a little slow now. Oh, there we go. Sorry. All right. So as I mentioned, we worked on some watershed plans for your region, the 2 that are on the screen. The date on the one on the left, the Ossipee Lake, which is the watershed plan for Danforth Ponds and the lower bays. It was completed in October 2017, but that was actually a revision. We really did a lot of the work in 2014 and 2015. And then when we completed the plan on the right, we made some revisions based on information we learned for Ossipee Lake and the other watershed plan. So both of these, as you can see, we worked for the Green Mountain Conservation Group in partnership with them. And the funding and kind of a advisory agency was the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, which has been very active helping to protect and improve rivers, lakes, and estuaries in New Hampshire. Okay, so a little bit about a watershed. So most of you probably know this, but a watershed is, the area where everything is. So this is the Ossipee Lake watershed, and everything in this gigantic area here is going to make its way down towards the lake. And one of the reasons Laura and I wanted to show you this map is Ossipee is a little bit unique this way, where you have, it's a fairly good sized lake, but it's a huge watershed. And what that means from a, environmental management, lake management perspective is that there are a lot of opportunities for pollutants to travel from this watershed into Ossipee Lake. So you have a lot more contributing factors than, some lakes. Some lakes we work with have a watershed that's would only be about this big. So really important. And what you see on this map, you have multiple towns: Ossipee, Effingham, Freedom, a little bit of Wakefield, Madison, Eaton, Tamworth, Sandwich, Albany, Waterville Valley, Moultonborough, a little bit of Tuftonborough. So it is a really large area. And the red circle here is showing the area where many of you are that we're really focusing on today, which is this Danforth Ponds watershed. So one other just kind of broad scale map we wanted to show you was the groundwater aquifers. So the sand and gravel aquifer. And again, most of you probably know this, but it's always impressive to see it visually on this map. So all the yellow that you're looking at are these underground sand and gravel aquifers, which are obviously primary drinking water sources for this area. And again, the red circle is the area where many of you are in today, and you can see you have a lot of that aquifer underneath you. And it's water resources and the environment and ecology, just like the human body, everything's connected, everything's linked. So it's really important to protect the groundwater resource. A lot of our talk tonight is really focusing on surface waters, but I just wanted to, make sure I made this point that, groundwater protection is equally as important. And again, there's other efforts that are going on in this region, and hopefully will continue to go on. So a little basics on lake management. And again, Laura will go into a bit more detail, but this is really important background for those of you that may not have read about this or learned about it in your time. So your lake ecosystem reflects a balance of inputs and outputs of material and energy that determines their water quality, right? So your lake is really made up of what's around the lake. And hundreds of years ago, when we were looking at a lake like Danforth Pond, this is the type of scenario we'd see, right? It was prime habitat, forested, no development, and the lake was generally thriving. Oh, I think we just need someone to mute there.
Well, I can do it on my computer.
And then what's happened over time, and not to be the bearer of bad news, but we love our lakes, right? Lakes are, as all of you know, are really precious resources in many different ways, but we sometimes love our lakes too much. And what we've learned, especially in the last 50 years or so since the Clean Water Act in 1972, is that we've given our lakes too much love. And some of the development we've done, even before 1972, maybe it was too close to the lake, and we lost a lot of the valuable habitat around the lake. And obviously, again, everything is interrelated. And if you have a breakdown in certain critters that live in the lake, it's going to affect everything, all the way up the food chain and throughout the food web. So what we've really strived to do as a company and with all the stakeholders that we work with is to find the balance. Land protection, watershed protection, restoration of our lakes and streams is challenging, but we're also faced with increasing development, and development can be done in a thoughtful way. I do believe that, but a lot of important analysis needs to be done, and a lot of transparent conversations need to happen to make sure things are happening in the right way and we are protecting these resources, because as we've seen over and over, damage can occur. And so here's a little bit more along those lines, and I'm going to talk a little bit about phosphorus. Okay, so phosphorus is a nutrient. It's in our bodies. It's everywhere in the natural environment, but in your lakes, it is very limited. There are very small amounts of phosphorus in your lake. And to give you an idea, when the Green Mountain Conservation Group is out, working with their partners and doing the monitoring on the lakes, they're measuring phosphorus in parts per billion. So you can imagine, 1 billion parts water, 1 part phosphorus. So, we started learning a lot about these in the 1960s, and I believe this photo on the left is from the 60s. And you can see a curtain was placed across the lake all the way to the bottom, a steel curtain. And, this was the general lake. And on this side of the lake, this was a study area in, I believe, Ontario, Canada. Phosphorus was added. And then you can see, the pea soup green color that happened here. And this is, what we're seeing take place in New Hampshire, in Maine, in New England, throughout the country, throughout the world. We're seeing, this process of too much phosphorus coming in, and the lakes essentially becoming fertilized. And, that's the example on the left. And unfortunately, Laura and I have worked on many lakes that turn that pea soup green color, especially right around this time of year. And then again, just to kind of reiterate a point in these pictures, hundreds of years ago, we had this natural environment, but when you start to develop parcels, as in this picture along the lakefront, you're often adding 10 times more phosphorus to the lake. And some of that's runoff, but a lot of it is you're taking away the vegetation that is uptaking those nutrients and helping, protect the lake, if you will. So just by the clearing of the vegetation, you're already increasing the phosphorus, and then you add driveways and rooftops, and we're adding more. So again, we love our homes, but sometimes these can have a negative impact. Sorry, bear with me. My computer is being a little slow here. All right, sorry. That's going too fast. All right, so where does phosphorus come from? We talk about, when I'm talking to the public and landowners, people say, fertilizers, and absolutely fertilizers, agriculture, septic systems are all sources of potentially phosphorus, but by quite a bit, the biggest source of phosphorus by volume is through sediment that's transported to your lake through ditches, through streams, through rivers, that's coming from this erosion and sedimentation. So our soil in New Hampshire has a lot of phosphorus naturally into it. So while this, doesn't look particularly good to the eye, it really is having a negative impact as it runs and flows into water bodies downstream, because the phosphorus that's attaching to the soil and depositing into the stream and eventually into your lake. And I remember, maybe 20 years ago, talking to I think it was the Board of Selectmen in Wakefield, New Hampshire, and they questioned whether, the sediment from a stream, a mile and a half away from the lake was actually getting there. Well, we know through research and studies that it does get there. And we can say that with a high level of confidence, because we measure that through water quality and other measures. So we really have to, watch out for that. And then again, I mentioned some of these threats already, the fertilizers, septic systems. Laura's going to talk a little bit about septic systems and how, as homeowners, what we can do. That lakefront development, geese. I remember doing our research in your area, and it was one of the highest concentrations of Canadian geese that I've seen since I've been doing this. So their droppings are very high in phosphorus as well. So pets and agriculture as well. So a couple quick slides and then I'll hand it over to Laura. But the watershed management planning process has been occurring in the Ossipee region for a while. And I just want to kind of point out where we are, building the public support, inventorying the watershed, defining the problems. This has all been done, setting goals, developing solutions, creating an action plan. And now it's really the time to implement and evaluate. So, find ways to put the actions into effect to protect and restore your lakes. And there are ways to do that. And I bring good news that there's more funding available through state and federal government than there ever has before to do some of the lake restoration, lake improvement work through the infrastructure bill and ARPA funds. So 10 years ago this was a little bit more challenging, but I think the timing is really good to make some changes. So again, the watershed plan, just to recap, it identifies and quantifies the pollutant sources. So we have those within those plans. We look at what the reduction of different pollutant levels, again, phosphorus, what that will be. What is the target? Where do we want these lakes and ponds to be? So we actually quantify these, and there's a lot of work that goes into that, as you might imagine. And then you'll hear Laura talk a little bit more about BMPs, and those are best management practices. They're protection strategies to achieve these pollutant reductions. And putting in what we call infiltration steps in front of your house so that the water isn't draining into the lake, but it's infiltrating into the ground is an example of a BMP. And you can make these BMPs look nice and they don't have to be expensive. So that's more good news. And again, I mentioned there's plans of action that are out there. These watershed plans should be updated, especially as technology advances, and we're learning, more and more each year, every 5 years, about what can be done for lake protection and water resources protection. So there are different grant funds available, including Section 319, and we can talk more about that. But the point being, having a watershed plan makes you eligible to receive a lot of grant funding. So that is already in place. So with that, and I'll help answer questions later, I will pass it to Laura, and it looks like she's got control.
Yes, thanks, Forrest. Yeah, so I wanted to dive right in and look a little bit more specifically at the Danforth ponds. And I just wanted to summarize some of the key points that came out of that 2015 with, like Forrest said, a 2017 update to the watershed management plan. And just to orient you again, Forrest already showed you a couple maps, but this map here is of the direct watershed to the Danforth ponds and the lower bays of Ossipee Lake. So that includes Broad, Levitt, and Berry Bays. And this is showing the land use cover for that area. Now, the plan was originally written because Danforth ponds was already experiencing some water quality issues. So there were issues with low dissolved oxygen in the lake. There was an increase in aquatic plant growth throughout the water body, and also the presence of invasive aquatic species. Some of the modeling that we did as part of that plan showed that the majority, 88% specifically, of the phosphorus was coming from watershed runoff. So all of these different land cover types were contributing 88% of the total phosphorus load entering Danforth ponds. And as you can imagine, with Forrest saying, that developed land areas contribute about 10 times as much phosphorus as forested land, the majority of that 88% load is coming from developed areas. So residential, commercial spaces, agricultural lands. So on this map, that would be anything in the reds and pinks and yellows and oranges would be your developed land cover types. Though smaller, but still of concern, and especially since there's some low dissolved oxygen issues in Danforth Pond, some of the phosphorus was also coming from what we call internal loading. So about 6% of the total load was coming from that. So that's when you have phosphorus that is coming from the watershed and it enters your pond. Some of that settles to the bottom sediments, and in late summer, when you have low dissolved oxygen concentrations, that can re-release that phosphorus back into the water column, where it can fuel plant growth or blooms. So we definitely flagged that in the plan as a potential issue to keep an eye on in the future. We also showed that shorefront septic systems represented about 4% of the phosphorus load to Danforth ponds. So obviously that's a concern, because the effluent that's coming from septic systems is, has a pretty short transport time from the system to the lake, and it's usually in a form that's more readily taken up by plants and algae. And there is some known issues with a few cesspools or holding tanks around the lake that would be a serious cause for concern. And then we also took a look at future development. We unfortunately weren't able to model Danforth ponds because the build out analysis that we completed was only for the town of Freedom. So we didn't have the full watershed, but we were able to model for the lower bays to show, you know, for the maximum development potential in the future, how much would that increase the phosphorus loading to the lake? And we estimated that it would increase the phosphorus loading to the lower bays by about 39%. So there'd be some similar magnitude increase to Danforth ponds as well. But that could be simulated in the future if there was additional funding. So you know, the point of looking at future development is to understand that existing sources are important, but equally important is, you know, taking a look at how these town ordinances are set up to best protect water quality in the future by making sure that development is balanced appropriately with natural resource protection. And so since that plan development, there's been some developments in the water quality degradation or status of Danforth ponds, and likely the reason that we're here talking with you tonight. So in the last few years, Danforth ponds has experienced several harmful cyanobacteria blooms. The first bloom actually started in Berry Bay, just above the dam, in June of 2018, and there was a 7-day advisory for Diclosternum. It's a cyanobacteria species. And then later that same year, in August of 2018, cyanobacteria blooms started in Middle Danforth Pond, and there was a 39-day advisory for Oscillatoria cyanobacteria species. And then again in 2019, you had a 4-day advisory. 2020, there was a 24-day advisory. 2021, a 7-day advisory. So far, so good for 2022. But your blooms tended to happen, you know, towards the end of August, early September. So we're right in that time frame. So we're, you know, hoping that you'll have a good year this year. But generally, the blooms were appearing as blue-green flecks throughout the water column. So this image came from DES for the Middle Danforth ponds. These are general images from DES across the state with different cyanobacteria bloom examples, but this one is specifically on the left from Danforth ponds. And so far, none of the other bays or ponds have had cyanobacteria issues in the last few years. So unfortunately, Danforth Ponds is not alone in this sudden issue with cyanobacteria blooms. There are many water bodies throughout New Hampshire that are suffering from these blooms just in the last 5 years. So the question becomes, you know, why are we experiencing these blooms now? Has there been some tipping point that's been reached? So there are a few working theories, but the overarching theme is it's generally this perfect storm of climate change with excess nutrient loading. So here I just wanted to show some of the factors that are promoting blooms in our New Hampshire lakes and ponds, so you can maybe get a better understanding of what's going on. You know, the first one is changes in winter lake processes. So we've been seeing a lot of reduced snowpack cover over ice, and that can allow more light penetration into the water and can promote growth even in the winter time. We're also seeing earlier ice outs and prolonged ice ins. So that prolongs the growing season for species like cyanobacteria. We also are seeing decreased groundwater supplies due to prolonged drought conditions. So when you have less cold groundwater input, that can warm these bottom waters and promote growth. And it can also increase the activity of microbes that are decomposing in those bottom waters. And when they decompose, they deplete oxygen and that can potentially trigger phosphorus release from sediment, that internal loading phenomenon that I described earlier, and again, fuel those blooms. Also related is warming air temperatures are also warming our lake waters. And again, that creates ripe conditions for these cyanobacteria to grow. There are also a number of cyanobacteria species that can actually regulate their buoyancy in the water column. So they can move up and down to make the most efficient use of both sunlight near the surface and then nutrients for growth, deep in some deeper waters. And then finally, excess nutrient loading from the watershed, and largely due to human activity. So just as Forrest pointed out, phosphorus is really the key limiting nutrient for growth in freshwater bodies that we're most concerned about. And all of these factors together create this environment for cyanobacteria to bloom and thrive. Out of all of these factors, we can really only control one, and that would be excess nutrient loading, which is really the focus for the watershed management plans that we develop, including the one for Danforth ponds. So moving forward into some of the strategies and how we can address that excess nutrient loading, arguably landowners, the folks that are largely on this call, really have the most power to control nutrient runoff from their properties and thus the loading of nutrients to lakes, and ultimately have the most power to make a difference for the lake's health. And so the saying is death by a thousand cuts, and that really couldn't be more true for lake systems. Every action, not only along the shoreline, but throughout the watershed, has an impact on a lake's water quality, no matter how big or small. And so, the question then becomes, what can you do to help? The biggest thing is educating yourself on how to properly manage your land and the activities that you conduct on it to try and minimize your impact to the lake as much as possible. These images on the right showcase some examples of what other landowners on New Hampshire lakes have done to try and address some of the stormwater runoff and nutrient control on their properties. And I'll get into that a little bit more on this slide. There's so many different actions that shoreline property owners can take to help minimize stormwater and erosion impact to water quality. The two key elements to slow runoff are infiltration and filtration. So we want to slow down the erosive power of stormwater to allow the ground to soak up the water and trap any unwanted pollutants like nutrients before reaching surface waters. And landowners can play a huge part in this by diverting runoff to gardens or other retention areas, stabilizing shoreline access points or pathways, maintaining or enhancing buffers, and minimizing any use of chemicals or fertilizers on the property. There are a number of resources available to landowners. There's so many places that you can start to get some more information on how you can be lake friendly. And so the number one would be to try and become Lake Smart certified through New Hampshire lakes. So you call them up and someone would come out to your property for a visit, and they would take a tour of your property and let you know where there are opportunities for you to address some erosion or stormwater runoff issues. And if you address those, they'll come back, reevaluate, and if you made those changes appropriately, you'll be officially Lake Smart certified. And there's a little plaque that you can hang on a tree to kind of let your neighbors know that you're doing your best to be lake friendly. There's a number of online resources that you can use as well. I list several here. So the UNH Extension Landscaping at the Water's Edge is a great resource to get you started on how to landscape to protect water quality. The New Hampshire DES, Soak Up the Rain New Hampshire program, also has a wonderful homeowner's guide for stormwater management, very user-friendly. And then, of course, there's DES shoreline rule fact sheets that you can look up to make sure that the work that you're doing to make those improvements also meet the shoreline rules for permitting. Have your septic system inspected and or pumped. I'll be going a little bit in more detail on that in a couple slides. And then participate in any future grant opportunities that would fund these improvements. So the hope is that you know, we can obtain some funding to help support landowners in making these improvements. But a lot of it will likely have to come from the landowners themselves with the help of all these resources. So some other solutions that were addressed in the watershed management plan was land conservation. That's probably one of the you know, most efficient tools, I guess, for water quality protection when you can conserve large chunks of land, especially when they're with connected habitats and have larger headwater areas to really protect water quality. That's kind of the biggest bang for your buck to limit development in those areas. Making changes to municipal ordinances so that they improve any new development practices. So, you know, that's trying to, you know, this image down here is just like an example of open space and cluster development, where you might have a large tract of land like this that can be developed, and instead of parceling all of these out into bigger lots, that would add more roads, access roads to those properties and larger clearing areas. They kind of condense the development into these cluster communities and then preserve the rest of that space as open protected space. And septic system maintenance, I'll be going over to that in a minute again. Road maintenance best practices, the images that Forrest showed of the road shoulder and ditch runoff, especially in New Hampshire because we're so rural. Gravel unpaved roads are notorious for being one of the major erosion and nutrient sediment sources to lakes. So being sure that those roads are being maintained appropriately to limit that erosion is pretty critical. And then last but certainly not least is agricultural best practices. So that's usually more of a one-on-one farmer working with the Natural Resource Conservation Service. Usually for larger farms, they develop a comprehensive nutrient management plan that really reviews all the agricultural practices and sets up a plan to say, if they're manuring a field, it's making sure that the timing of that application is appropriate so that most of the nutrients stay on the field when they're actually needed, instead of during a time of year when they might wash off easily and enter our streams and lakes. So again, I wanted to highlight septic system management as a key element to protecting the Danforth ponds because of the known issues. One of the first ones is any holding tanks or cesspools should really be replaced with a properly sited and installed septic system that will allow for some treatment of the effluent. Any older systems, about 25 years or more, should really be professionally evaluated for proper functioning. The cost generally runs $250 to $450 for a system evaluation. So not too terribly expensive, but again, there are some grant opportunities that could help alleviate that cost burden to some landowners that might need it. But that's really important to understand whether the system needs to be upgraded or replaced. General maintenance is pumping out your tank every 2 to 3 years, even if it's seasonal. Sometimes, even if you're not using it a lot and you're not necessarily filling it up as quickly as a year-round home, if the system isn't sited properly or insulated properly, less use of a system can actually make it more vulnerable to degradation and ultimately malfunction if you have pipes that aren't regularly flushing, and they might get clogged, or in the winter they might freeze if there's not enough insulation overhead. So it's good to have your tank pumped out, and they usually do a quick inspection of the tank while they're pumping it out to let you know the condition of it. So that's really important. A big one is ensuring that the occupancy use, so the number of people that are using the system, doesn't exceed the system's design capacity. So this can be really tricky in the summer when you have large family gatherings, right? You might have a 2-bedroom cottage on a lake that really can only support a few people at any given time, but for maybe a long weekend, you have 12 or 24 people that are visiting and using that system. It really stresses these systems out and makes them at much higher risk for failure, and they do fail. I've known several landowners that have had complete system failures after a busy, high-use weekend with family visiting. So something to keep in mind for sure. And then, of course, following any proper maintenance rules. So it's kind of the do's and don'ts, not flushing certain products down your toilet, making sure that you're protecting your leach field, not letting trees grow on it, don't put any heavy machinery on your leach fields that would compact it, things like that. And all of that type of information is available through New Hampshire DES. They have a number of informational pamphlets. There's so much information available online to show that.
Laura, just want to pause real quickly to make sure everyone on this Zoom has muted. We're getting some interference. Thank you for making sure you are muted.
Yes, and Matt, I think you can, as the host, you can manually mute. Okay, so Forrest and I came up with 3 lake examples where they've, implemented the recommendations in their watershed management plans and made some significant improvements. So the first example that I'm showing here is the town of New Durham, specifically Mary Meeting Lake. So here's the Mary Meeting River watershed. Mary Meeting Lake is in the headwaters here, most of which, or at least all of the Mary Meeting Lake, is in the town of New Durham, New Hampshire. And here's a photo of the lake here. It's one of, if not the cleanest lake in New Hampshire, I think is the claim to fame. And so they take it very seriously in protecting their lake water quality and making sure that it stays the cleanest water in New Hampshire. And so one of the ways that they did that was they developed a Mary Meeting Lake watershed overlay district. So it's a specific zoning district that they can apply certain rules to within, basically within the bounds of the New Durham town. And then within this watershed area in orange is the Mary Meeting Lake overlay district. And what they did was they rezoned this area around the lake so that there's a 12-acre lot minimum on any new development moving forward. So that really limited development. This map here is results from a build out analysis that we did for the entire watershed of the Merry Meeting River. The yellow dots, if you can see them, are existing buildings, and the red dots are all projected new buildings that could be developed in the watershed based on existing ordinances in respective towns, and also any development constraints, right? So you can't develop, you know, in a lake or in a stream, so, or on really, really steep slopes. So it excludes all that type of area, and then plugs a building where it could be sited down the road. So you can see there's a big difference between the town of Alton and the town of New Durham, where New Durham instituted that 12-acre lot minimum. So it really spaced out the buildings. These big chunks here are actually major conservation lands that this community has rallied together to purchase. You know, I mean, this is millions of dollars of conservation land to prevent development. So really nice success story for them, so that you know, they can enjoy excellent water quality into the future. Oh, and another point, the reason for the 12-acre lot minimum was, the intent was, if you had a 12-acre lot, 2 acres could be set aside for development of your, you know, your home, your lawn, and then 10 acres could be set aside for current use, which helps to lower taxes, and then also, you know, prevents development on that land in the future. Another example is the town of Meredith in Lake Waukesha. So they also established a watershed overlay district for Lake Waukesha, and they set an ordinance that requires the evaluation of septic systems within 250 feet of Lake Waukesha. So that's the shoreline zone. For any septic systems that don't have an approved permit on file, they were required to have their systems formally evaluated, and proof of that evaluation had to be sent to the town. And so that's been really successful. They partnered with the Lake Winnipesaukee Association, who obtained a grant to help with some of that cost burden to property owners. So they were able to provide the funds to those landowners to, you know, covering the cost of the septic system evaluation. And then for those that were evaluated and found to be in failure, they also had a cost share program through that grant, where they were able to offset some of the costs to have those septic systems replaced for the landowner. So again, a nice success story there. And then our third example is the town of Chesterfield. This is for Spofford Lake. And this example is focused more on, you know, on the ground design and construction work to treat those, you know, stormwater runoff, erosion issues. So they completed a phase 1 of a grant that is administered through DES. It's what we call 319, because it falls under the section 319 of the Clean Water Act. So these are funds that EPA gives to all the states, and then the states have programs to you know, issue requests for proposals, and they select a subset of applicants to administer those EPA funds to groups. So the Spofford Lake community received funding a few years ago in phase 1. So the grant itself was about $73,000, when you include match, both cash and in kind, so that includes, volunteer time from the Lake Association, the total cost ended up being $189,000, where they installed, smaller projects on residential properties, commercial property. There was some bigger stormwater, swales that were installed. This was a community beach that had some pretty severe stormwater runoff issues. And so a major riprap, rockline swale was established with like a culvert outlet, some culvert replacements to better align some of these stream, road crossings. And they've been successful again with a phase 2 grant. So they got a little bit more money. About the grant itself is covering $113,000. We're estimating it'll probably be a similar magnitude, total grant of $192,000. It's just getting started now. It's going to be a bigger construction project aimed at fixing some stormwater runoff issues for their boat ramp and parking lot that's on a pretty steep grade and receives stormwater runoff from a state route running through the town. So, and then they also were just successfully awarded a Clean Water State Revolving Fund loan that actually turned into a grant for a subset of those awardees through the ARPA fund. So that's the federal infrastructure bill funding that Forrest mentioned earlier. So they were awarded, the town was $100,000 to complete design work for a number of BMPs throughout the watershed. And then the hope is to take all those plans and we would apply for a different grant that would cover the actual construction implementation within a year or two. So really great work with Spofford, great success story. They're getting a lot of action on the ground with treating some of these issues around their watershed. So some next steps for the Danforth Ponds communities. We encourage the towns and private residents to really act now. Taking action now to restore the health of these lakes will be an important investment to best protect these lakes from the impacts of climate change, as I discussed earlier. And we really, we should try and do all that we can now to limit nutrients and other pollutants to our lakes. Now, that we're facing warming and unpredictable climate change, and so any, the thinking is that any actions that we take today should pay out enormously down the road when you're, prevention, or in this case, early restoration, is far less expensive than full restoration of a completely degraded water body. So some steps some next steps that should be taken is, first trying to raise funds. So that's looking at grants, loans, donations to try and complete some priority fixes that were identified in the plan. Continuing or enhancing monitoring, establishing a long-term baseline to assess change over time is really important, especially as you start to make, changes and improvements throughout the watershed. Getting landowners, as educated and aware as possible, so that, any activities that they do on their own land are really taking into account the impact to the lake and is trying to minimize that impact to the lake. And then the towns can maybe take a look at some of their local regulations and even maintenance practices conducted through the DPW to really see where improvements could be made to protect water quality. And the overall message, is that you can do it. I'm not saying that it's not going to be a lot of work. it will require a fairly substantial coordinated effort with a dedicated team, but you have so many supporting groups through the Green Mountain Conservation Group, through the towns, and participation from the watershed residents. And, if you act all together, it, really great things can happen. And as Forrest indicated, there's an unprecedented amount of funding available out there right now. So, even a few years ago, a lot of this would have been pretty daunting because of the lack of available funds, but we're in a period of time right now where there's so much opportunity. And so this is a great time to reinvigorate interest in trying to implement the Danforth Ponds plan and really get some boots on the ground and some action done. So
Right.
that's all that I had. So we're happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Laura. Let's jump into a few questions. We can, if people can stay on a little longer. Let's start with Mark Longley's question. Do ineffective shoreline septic systems contribute significant amounts of contaminants other than phosphorus?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Bacteria is the first one that, we look at, and also nitrogen, which can have an impact. We focus more on phosphorus and freshwater system in freshwater areas, and nitrogen in estuaries and more, saltwater systems. But yeah, absolutely. And as Laura mentioned, the tricky part with septic systems is that, the problems are happening oftentimes without us knowing it. So maintenance is such a big deal.
Right. Rick Vanderpool is asking have coarse woody additions been considered as a watershed-wide strategy for trapping more sediments in existing waterways?
Yeah, that's a great question by Rick. And for everyone, coarse woody additions is referring to, trees and branches and kind of, the natural fallout around the edge of a stream or a lake. That's actually a natural process that's really healthy. And I don't know of watershed-wide strategies. I do know that the U.S. Forest Service employs these sorts of techniques quite frequently, including in New Hampshire. I know in the Pacific Northwest, they use this, but it's a great idea to look at trapping sediments and almost, creating these natural dams within these waterways that also create habitat. So I'm not saying it hasn't happened, but just not off the top of my head, unless Laura knows about anything.
Forrest, I can add a little bit. Tin Mountain, we've done now 25 streams, about 22 miles of treatment, and we're now working with watershed associations like Winnipesaukee, particularly Winter Harbor, Lake Wentworth Association. So I think the idea is to see if we can, like you say, all hands on deck, use all the tools available to try and prevent, when runoff does occur, from reaching the water bodies we want to protect. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Absolutely. Keep up the good work, Rick.
Thanks, Forrest. You too.
Great. So Tom Gross asks, is there evidence in Danforth ponds of phosphorus triggered fish kills and invasive species of plants proliferating in addition to the cyano events?
I don't know of that, but Tom makes a good point about some of the dangers of cyanobacteria. And it's been linked to Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, which is a horrific disease. Professor Jim Haney at UNH has been one of the top researchers looking at that. In the paper here in Portland, Maine, a couple of dogs died from toxic algae, cyanobacteria in Cumberland, taking a walk in the park. So it's dangerous, to fish, but it's also really dangerous to humans. And I think we're going to hear more and more about this as time goes on and the cyanobacteria becomes so much more prevalent. And certainly fish kills is something that has been seen. I just don't know about Danforth Pond unless someone else does.
Hey, Matt,
Yeah.
Bruce Howlett from the Freedom Aquatic Invasive Species Committee.
Hi, Bruce.
Just wanted to bring up that Upper Danforth and Middle Danforth have for over 15 years had proliferation of milfoil. And it's tied to the sediment base where the main lake and Broad Bay have more sandy bottoms. We have a more sediment-based bottom that allows the roots to establish, and we've had an ongoing addressing the problem. And this year, fortunately, we don't have to do a chemical treatment. We're just doing a minor dye for 2 days.
Thank you, Bruce. Betsy Eaton's asks I don't know which lake you're referring to, Betsy. Are there still cesspool systems along the lake?
Yeah, I don't know. We don't have boots on the ground there right now. We just know that when we did the Danforth Pond study, there were some cesspools, so no filtration happening in the septic systems. I don't know if, again, anyone locally knows if they still exist, but that's certainly a potential major problem if they do.
Okay. And Mark Longley follows up with, what types of professionals are qualified to evaluate residential septic systems?
Yeah, great question. These are all great questions. Licensed site evaluators or licensed septic system evaluators. So there's an actual title, and it's usually someone that's got a good knowledge of soils and kind of some water resources as well. So you can go online and look for licensed septic system or licensed site evaluators. And that's Laura mentioned the Lake Waukee example. That's a drinking water supply in Meredith, and they utilize licensed site evaluators to basically help people, and a grant help pay for that.
Okay, thank you, Tom, for your kind words. And Betsy also asks, how can we engage landowners that are not on lakes to improve our water quality? Big question.
Yeah, that's such a good question, and I think we hear this all the time. I think that's a case where really working through the municipality is really helpful, and it's education and outreach, and knowing that a cleared lot a mile away from the lake can get to the lake. So again, the outreach work the Green Mountain Conservation Group does is really some of the best I've seen. So outreach and education, and really talking to the towns. And Tom Gross and I remember we had several years ago we spoke about land conservation, and I think at least 8 towns, and we had a captive audience. So that's a great way to get the word across, is invite yourself to a select board meeting, and now they're televised, right? So that word gets out.
Right. So Martha is asking about more specific information on possible grant help for us to replace our old septic system. I think in the interest of time, we have Martha, we have everyone's email, and maybe we can provide that information to you tomorrow via email. So sound good. Karen McCall, is it effective to educate building, construction, and landscaping professionals to implement lake safe practices?
Yeah, really good question. And I guess based on my experience, there's a little bit of a void there, especially reaching the landscapers. There's been, Cooperative Extension has done workshops from time to time, but there's a lot of turnover in these businesses. So you train someone 1 year, and then 2 years later, it's a whole new crew. So that's a definite void. There's a definite void there.
Okay, and also Martha's interested in grant opportunities to help install BMPs. So we can connect with you on that. Karen McCall has also asked, if we find a dead fish in a water body, does it make sense to send it to a lab to rule out something serious like cyanobacteria?
Yeah, Laura, do you know that? I mean,
Uh, No, because if it is, usually, obviously fish can die from the toxins that cyanobacteria release, but they need to be pretty high concentration. So it would be pretty obvious that a cyanobacteria bloom was occurring. And so you could connect the fish kill to the cyanobacteria bloom in that way. But more often it's more of an indirect effect, because when you have a bloom or even excessive plant growth that then dies back and starts to be decomposed, it'll consume the oxygen in the water. And when that oxygen is consumed at a time of year when the waters are really warm, it can be really hard for fish to find, that cooler, higher oxygen water that they really need to thrive. And so that's when you start to see fish dying off. So if you have warm, calm days later in summer, and you see some fish floating up, it's usually because the waters are a little too warm and there's not enough oxygen in the water.
Okay, thank you. Those are all the questions in the chat bubble. Does anyone want to unmute and voice a quick question before we wrap up?
it looks like Martha had a question asking, why haven't we had a bloom this year? No rain. Laura, yeah, I know you're tuned in to the blooms, and they're still happening across the state, and it's sometimes a little bit unpredictable, right?
Yeah, it really depends on the individual lake. Forrest had mentioned that every lake is unique, and that's very true. So, there are several lakes that are experiencing massive blooms right now, and others that aren't, and that would normally see them, such as yourself. So, and that usually stems from where the primary phosphorus source is coming from. So in your case, most of it's coming from the watershed. So I think the no rain theory could be fairly valid in this case, where you're not having as much nutrient loading, in the early to midsummer. So I know, at least around us, and I'm a little bit more east than you guys, we had some pretty decent rain in the last week, which you may have all experienced as well. So I definitely would be on the lookout for potential blooms in the next week or two if we get some warm days, now that your ponds may have had a pulse of nutrients pretty recently. But fingers crossed that you make it through this season, and certainly through the Labor Day weekend, so you can enjoy it.
Matt, Tim Otterbach, Forrest, Laura. I know there was a question a few minutes ago about whether there were any existing cesspools or substandard septic systems around the lake and bays. Well, I don't know about the bays, but I know at one point in its previous iteration, Green Mountain had done a voluntary canvassing of the lake residents relative to septic systems. And I don't know what the results were of that, but I believe there were still at that point some that were pretty old, but I don't know what the status was.
Well, we can check the files on that.
Matt, I have one question, I guess. Maybe we can't answer it in this moment, but I know it's a topic you and I and Forrest and others have spoken a lot about, and that is the important relationship with municipal leaders, selectmen, conservation commissions, planning boards, town management, in terms of all of these issues. I'm wondering how many of our participants tonight are municipal leaders. And at that point that you raised, Forrest, that science meets civics, what potential, and these are questions we can't answer right now, but questions we'll continue to talk about. What can we do to kind of strengthen our relationship with town leaders around this this constellation of challenges?
Yeah, that's such a great thought. And here in New England, especially northern New England, municipal government is so, it's strong, right? I mean, our counties, our county government, does a lot less than say, the Midwest or the southern part of our country. So it's really important to reach those municipal leaders. And again, frequently, right, there's a lot of turnover, not necessarily in the staff, but there are often a lot of turnover in the volunteer positions. So keep that. Yeah. So good. A very good point, Tom. We can't talk to our local officials enough, I think.
Well, we're delighted. We can tell there are quite a few of them joining us tonight. We
Wonderful. Well,
appreciate your
thanks. Very
interest.
welcome.
Yes. So Jeff Nickel says Merry Meeting Lake was given as an example as a clean lake. I understand that there is a 12-acre lot size requirement, but are there other town ordinance-driven measures in place that contributed to the success of this lake?
Yeah, Laura, I believe there's a lake protection ordinance as well, right? That restricts other activities.
Yeah, there's some other regulations under that that watershed overlay district that I mentioned. That the most impactful one is the 12-acre lot size requirement, but there's other, smaller, ordinance and development restrictions within that overlay district within the town. So, but those are all pretty recent. The development around the lake is very similar to what you see elsewhere, at least directly around the lake. I think they've also done a really good job at conserving large tracts of land in their headwaters and protected their headwater tributaries that are feeding into the lake. And then also the bathymetry, the actual shape and depth of the lake is also extremely helpful in keeping the lake clean itself. There's like a constellation of factors that went into why Merry Meeting is still really clean.
And I'll add that Bob Craycraft, who is well known in the state and works with Green Mountain Conservation Group on their monitoring programs, was on the planning board in New Durham, and was a lot of the reason that things happen there.
Right. Well, here's a good question from Betsy Eaton for us to wrap up with. What are your thoughts on how we can broaden this message to the general population?
Yeah, wow, that's a good question. I like what Laura had in one of her slides, really talking that, as a landowner, as a homeowner, you can do a lot. And I think a lot of people might look to, well, we need an ordinance, we need that, and that's absolutely important. But there's a lot you can do on your, half acre or whatever it is around the lake to control runoff, plant, high bush blueberries, and really make it, kind of a more of a lake friendly environment. And getting that message out to your neighbors is really important.
Thank you so much, Forrest and Laura, and thank you, Tom and Saco Headwaters Alliance and our friends at the Friends of Danforth Ponds for making this happen. And thanks to all of you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at a future GMCG and Saco Headwaters Alliance presentation. So thanks for your concern and your interest and your support for all the work that's being done here.
Thanks so much. It was a pleasure.
Yep, it was. Take care, everyone.
Have a good evening. Good night, all.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.